Start that now.
Amazing. So yesterday we talked a lot about how patterns work, like when you are sewing from a pattern, whether it's a vintage pattern or a new one, how to kind of get started with that. We talked a little bit about fabric. So like if you weren't here, I'm using a silk that I bought from Fab Scrap, which does like fabric reclamation. And for the like overdress, I'm using like a tulle netting, which I found on the side of the road, which was amazing. But I've not really sewn with like mesh netting before. So we'll just see how that goes. Every day is an exploration, but so I spent the time after we finished up like the workshop yesterday, working on finishing the edges of like each pattern piece. So a piece we talked about yesterday, this is like bodice back. So when you're thinking about the dress, this is the piece that goes on the bust line to the back. And it just looks like this. There's pattern markings on it so that you can see how it'll connect to the other pieces. And what I did yesterday after we finished class was I finished all the edges with like a zigzag stitch along just the edge of the fabric. So all that is like I had my sewing machine on like a zigzag setting and I just went around the edges. Other ways to kind of finish the fabric so that it never frays, that's what you're preventing by doing that, is by using a serger, which is a different kind of machine that's specifically for finishing edges and for sewing together really stretchy fabrics. Or using what's called pinking shears, which are scissors that have little zigzag markings along them, and like the zigzag cuts the fabric along the grain so that it won't fray. What I do is I'll finish the edges. Also, if you're like hemming or seaming the fabric in specific ways, so if you have, say, a French seam, you won't need to do this. I kind of just always like to do this because I'm always forgetting which edges I'm supposed to like finish versus not, and I kind of err on the safe side. It takes more time, but it's just like, it's what happens. So I'm gonna jump in today with sewing and with starting like pattern based on looking at the pattern instructions. So let's just jump right in. I have the instructions next to me. Normally they're just like laid out on the floor, however I feel like it. But it says like dress view 1, which is, let me see if I can like have a like convenient way of showing this, probably not. But we're starting with dress view 1. Is this reverse? Is this fine? But the first step is to just work on the upper bodice portion that I was just showing you. We're gonna do darts, and then we're gonna connect the bodice pieces to the side of the bodice pieces. So there's usually like a handy little illustration, and then there will be like the written instructions. So let's see if we can like make this all happen in a way that's like not too loud, and just get started. So we talked a little bit about darts yesterday and how that's kind of how dresses are given form. Things that like non-stretch fabrics that have to lay close to the body need darts because that's how fabric becomes like from a flat piece of fabric to a three-dimensional form. Even though fabric is obviously like fluid, it still needs to like have some kind of 3D element because it's against your body, which is a 3D element as well. But darts look like this. It's a little triangle. It's drawn out on the pattern piece, and I'll copy it over onto the fabric. This is like the wrong side of the fabric. It's the fabric that's going to be on the inside, so it's not visible on the outside. But what I'll do is like connect this little triangle in this way so that each of the sides of the triangle match up on either side. And then what I'm going to do is pin it together like along the seam lines. So it goes through. Checking to see on the other side that it's like correct. And then I'll usually do just like 2 pins. So here's one piece. You want the pins on the side such that when you're sewing, like the majority of the fabric will be on your left side where the sewing machine like isn't like where the machine is cutting off. And then like you're sewing along this dart, if that makes sense. But we'll do it again and you'll be able to see. So here's like the second dart. This is the side dart. It's a little bit bigger. I'm going to just fold the edges together so that like the pen markings line up on both sides. And the dart lines up, like the point of the dart lines up on both sides. And then I'm going to use my pins and like stick it through. There we go. Sometimes it's a little like trickier for me to see exactly, to get it exactly lined up on both sides. That's fine, like give it a few tries. It's not a big deal. Go.
Do you cut off the excess fabric from the darts when you're done?
So once the dart is sewn, let me just pin this real quick. So let's like go ahead and sew 2 of these darts. There's another 2 darts on the other side, but let's go ahead and sew these. So once the dart is sewn, you're gonna have like an excess fabric. If the fabric is really bulky, let's just sew it and talk about it then. Getting ahead of ourselves. Thank you for your question, Mom. So what I have here is I have my sewing machine fully threaded. If you ever have questions on sewing machine setup, either go to a local sewing machine store. They will be able to talk about your specific machine, or we can talk about it, or you can find manuals online. I've set it to a straight, so it's computerized, it's a little hard to see, but I've set it to a straight stitch setting on the left side of like the needle bar, and then it's a normal stitch length. These are things that kind of will vary from machine to machine and fabric to fabric. So I think this machine has automatic tension control, but other machines you'll have to adjust the tension based on the kind of fabric you're using. So if you're using a very light fabric like a chiffon or a rayon or a light silk, then what you need to do is have a lower tension setting so that the fabric doesn't pucker. And if you're using a heavier fabric like wool, you're going to need a higher tension setting. But this machine has automatic control. And so I'm just gonna start sewing. I want my needle to line up with where like the blue of my fabric drawing is. There we go. And then what I do is I'm gonna start sewing. I'm going to back tack so that it doesn't release, and then I'm going to continue down the line. So let's get started. Hopefully this is not too loud. And then I back tack because that like prevents the seam from unraveling. And then I continue sewing. And I pull out my pin while I sew in order to like maintain the shape, but without sewing over the pin. Let's see. Once I get to the end of the dart, with darts in particular, you don't want to back tack because otherwise the point of the dart will pucker and you'll be able to see it on the other side. So you just want to leave a long string. Some people tie theirs. And then this is what it'll look like on the outside. So like that's what a dart looks like. If you look at your clothes, I'm sure you'll see them. They're on shorts, they're on skirts, they're on like more tailored tops, but it just looks like this. What my mom was asking about earlier is whether you want to trim this excess fabric off. Some people also will like cut it in half so you can iron it to lay flat. What I will often do, because I don't want to damage the fabric, is just iron it down. If the fabric is particularly heavy, you'll see it on the other side, which is like not what you want. But in this case, I'm just going to press it down once I'm done with all my darts. But of course, like cutting it off or cutting it in half are both possible. It just like leaves the fabric open to fraying. So let's do a second dart. So forward, back tack. Progressively removing the little pins. There we go. So now 2 darts on the left side of this. Like that's what they look like. It's just a dart. But we're gonna do this 2 more times, and that's gonna be all the darts in the bodice section. The rest of the dress is mostly brought together by like gathers or by, yeah, I think it's just mostly gathering stitches, but we'll talk about that later. How's everyone's Labor Day going?
Well, it barely started.
Barely started. My mom and Samantha and maybe some other people are on the West Coast, so it's very early in the morning. And I think Audrey's here and she's in Estonia.
Rose is. She left.
I'll let Audrey answer that. Oh, and BP is also on the West Coast, aren't you? Thank you guys for waking up so early.
Lydia's awake today, though.
Thank you guys for waking up so early and coming to this. So nice of you.
It's a great way to start the day.
Yeah, that's true. I was just thinking yesterday, I was like, what's my ideal day? I was like, I would wake up, I would like maybe have some breakfast, and then I would just sew for like 6 hours. Yeah. So lucky me that is my day.
How long will this take you, do you think?
So for full disclosure, I like worked on it a bunch last night. I didn't do the sewing. I just prepped like a lot of pieces. And that took like another 6 hours because I actually had to cut out all of the netting for the overdress. And then I had to like finish all these pieces. And it's going to be kind of, I mean, more will be revealed, but it's going to be kind of a little like, and the cake was already done moment on a cooking show because I like did some of the parts on like the bodice facing, which is going to be the like interior of the bodice because I need to attach boning. And I was like, I don't want to be redoing darts when I also need to be like learning and talking about a new technique that I've never done before. So like there was a lot of work to be done in between when I finished yesterday's workshop, which was 2 hours. And then when I like, what you see here today. So it's a long time. It's a lot of prep. And then today we'll see how far we get, but and how much I want to save for like tomorrow's like final workshop. But I still anticipate that I'll spend like several hours after the class.
Is this your most like involved project? Like, is this the biggest one you've ever done?
No, Tuesday. Let me see.
Tuesday. In terms of like sheer size of the project, like physical size, this is definitely the biggest because it's like a massive dress. And I would say this is probably also like the most new techniques because there's so much work with tulle and there's work with boning and then like I don't know, like it's a lot of components that have to come together. Here's like the second side of the bodice with the darts. There you go. Like this like goes on the bust. It looks like this. Ta-da.
Amazing job. It looks great.
Thank you.
Yeah, it looks like really nice fabric too.
Yeah, it's like a very beautiful, like actually very strong and somewhat heavy, like silk georgette.
Yeah, I was like, is that like 3-ply silk or whatever? It looks kind of like, it looks really nice.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a georgette, which means that the silk threads are twisted before they're woven.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a much stronger fabric than we think of like maybe a silk chiffon, which is very airy. This is actually like a pretty heavy fabric. Like as a wedding dress, you have to be wearing, like this has to be like a fall wedding or something because it's gonna be like pretty warm, I think. I'm going to now press the darts because this bodice piece needs to be sewn to like bodice sides. And when I'm sewing it to the sides, I want the darts to be like consistently sewn. I'm going to press them upwards. It's kind of personal choice, but what I've heard is that like pressing them upwards like lifts the bust because it like is this upwards illusion. It really doesn't matter. I mean, no one's gonna wear this dress, but it's kind of personal choice. Again, like my mom mentioned, you can just like cut them apart and then press them down. I'm just so, I mean, I'm like pathologically afraid of cutting fabric because I'm like afraid of it fraying, but I don't know. As I've mentioned several times, sewing is a very like, it's like for me, it's very much not an academic exercise. A lot of it's kind of just based on feeling and just like, okay, like this is how I'm feeling about like where I want this project to go or like what I'm worried about. So I don't know. A lot of my like personal problems come out when I'm sewing. This is definitely going to be like a very large project, but one thing I think about is like when I was first sewing and like picking up projects or maybe picking up projects that would be considered like too challenging for my like very amateur level, those are very difficult and I like felt very overwhelmed by certain portions. So like in a way that like I feel concerned about certain parts of this project. I do not know how the netting is gonna go, but like I still at the same time feel more confident than I ever did like when I was learning to sew. So like it's a big project and I'm probably my biggest, but definitely not like the most intimidating. I've worked with like 1930s and 40s patterns that like are called, they're termed unprinted patterns, which means they don't even have any markings. They just have like punch holes out where you're supposed to like make darts and like match seams and stuff like that. And those are like, my first time working with one of those was extremely confusing and like kind of frightening. So this is very legible in comparison, but I don't know. Everything's difficult in different ways.
Do the patterns tell you, do the patterns tell you what kind of stitches and stuff to use, or do you have to decide that on your own?
Yeah, so in general, that's a really good question. In general, you're going to be using, like whenever you're attaching pieces together, when you're making darts, when you're like adding pleats, stuff like that, you're going to be using like just a normal straight stitch. And what a straight stitch looks like is just, it's going to be one of these two. Can we see this? Yes. So it's like one of these first two. It's like usually like the first stitch on the pattern. It looks like this or like this. I use the leftmost one. I use this one for attaching invisible zippers and stuff like that. It depends on what foot I'm using, but you can get by like really far just doing a straight stitch. Reinforcement, you might need a zigzag, and for my seam finishing, I use a zigzag. For things like gathering, you have to do 2 straight stitches in a row and then pull them together. But in general, you will be using a straight stitch, and like pattern instructions will generally tell you otherwise, but it's just rare that you wouldn't be using like, say, a straight stitch.
Do you use a different kind of thread because you're sewing with silk?
So I'm using a white polyester thread. You can also, for example, use like cotton thread. It might shrink in the wash. Polyester thread is strong and like thin. So that's what I'm using. I am using a different needle. So normally for my like day-to-day projects, when I'm sewing with cotton, when I'm sewing with like synthetics, I'll use what's called a universal needle. If I'm sewing with stretch fabrics, I'll use what's called a jersey or stretch or ballpoint needle. For this one, I'm using this Microtex needle. So they're especially thin needles and very sharp because silk is a delicate fabric that like rips and frays easily. So like using a sharp needle will make your work a lot easier. In general, you're fine with universal unless you're doing something specific like silk. Or, I mean, sewing stretch fabrics is like very popular. People enjoy wearing stretch clothing, and it's just like, it's not what I normally sew. I like working with cottons or natural fibers. But with stretch fabrics, you want to use like a ballpoint needle again, so it doesn't fray. But these are things that like, the thing is, like, I'm truly a firm believer that unless you're sewing at a more like professional level, you're like designing something for like a client or whatever, if you're just sewing for yourself, it should be for joy. And like worrying about things like, oh my God, am I using the exact right needle, is like, maybe that does not bring you joy. So don't worry about it too much. It's going to be fine. Not the end of the world. You have a sewing machine, you're going to be fine. But like, whatever. I mean, we all have things that we want to like think about more. To attach the bodice, to the bodice back side piece. I guess it's called bodice back. Yeah, they connect at the side seam. So right underneath the armpit. I'm connecting the right sides together because I want the seam to be on the inside, which means right sides of the fabric have to go together. When it opens up, it'll look like this, and like the right sides will both be facing out. The wrong sides are the ones that I'm looking at right now. They have the markings on them. I'm looking at them. I've pinned it at this little dash that's on both sides that I made when I was like cutting out my pattern pieces. Both sides have this little dash marking. And I've also used the pins on the inside of like the 5/8 inch or 1/2 inch mark. So when I'm sewing along here, like along on my sewing machine, I want to sew like 5/8 of an inch like of seam allowance. So most modern clothes like that you see, first of all, many modern clothes like that are made out of stretch fabrics, they're all going to be serged together. So you're not going to see any kind of seam allowance. But if you look at a cotton shirt that you have that's sewn together, like a non-stretch cotton, you'll see that the seams on both sides are very small. It saves fabric, so it's cheaper. And honestly, it makes it so that you can't take the shirt out if you need it to get bigger. That's like why vanity sizing, or what we know as vanity sizing, is this, because a shirt sold as a small was meant to be tailored down to fit a person. So it wasn't meant for a small person. It was meant for like a medium person, and then was intended to be created to be made smaller to like fit that person's exact proportions. But like seam allowances like that to take shirts out or clothing out and in doesn't exist anymore, except in home sewing or in like more, I guess, like couture level sewing, maybe like custom bespoke garments, it'll be more apparent. But like when you're home sewing, you want between a 5/8 inch and a 1/2 inch seam allowance. That will be specified on the pattern piece. Let me grab one. So here's the pattern piece that I'm using right now. It's midriff back, and you can see that the difference between the cutting line and the seam line is 5/8 of an inch. It'll say that on the pattern as well. So when I'm sewing, I don't want to be sewing like right along and like having the tiniest bit of leftover on the edge that I can. That was always me when I first started sewing, because I was like, oh, I want it to like exactly fit the pattern pieces. Patterns are designed so that they have a fairly significant seam allowance, especially by today's standards. Patterns will vary a little bit depending between like 1/2 an inch and 5/8. 5/8 seems random, but you kind of just get used to it. So I'm like setting up these two pieces next to each, like that I've pinned together. Sometimes I'll use less pins. Silk is so slippery that I'm using 2 pins, like consistent amount of pins along here. I back tack, sewing backwards. I back tack at the ends. And then, as you can see, I have the seam right here, and then the needles, the pins are on the inside of that allowance. So if they've created any holes in the fabric, you can see there's like a tiny nick in the fabric. It's inside of the seam allowance. It'll never be visible. And then you open it up. It looks like this. They're sewn together. Great, let's do the other side. I have my existing bodice piece. It's here. To the inside of that, I'm gonna connect this midriff, or yeah, bodice midriff back piece, yeah. I'm like mixing up all my terms. I'm connecting the like appropriate piece in the appropriate location. Here, the little like zig, the 2 zigs on both sides are on the same place, and I'm gonna pin it. Great. So like all of sewing is kind of just like this. Like all you're doing when you're sewing from a pattern is just like looking at where the little pattern pieces match up and then sewing them together. That's why I like it. I love like the historical aspect of sewing from patterns. It's very meditative for me. I really enjoy using old patterns. So I think that's what I like. I think for a while, like when I first started getting really into sewing, I was like, wow, like I should just be designing my own clothes. Like I'm gonna like this is just a stepping stone for me to be like able to make my own patterns exactly how I want them. I love patterns. I love historical patterns. They're so beautiful. There's so much variation. They're so complex. Like I've learned so many techniques I never would have learned otherwise. Like I'm happy like doing this kind of sewing for the rest of my life, maybe.
I'm curious how you choose like what era, or maybe is there an era that you just love to sew vintage patterns from?
It's funny because I also collect vintage clothing, and my favorite era to collect is probably the 40s. I think those dresses are so beautiful, and I also love the fabric feel of like 1940s rayon. I think it's like extremely nice, but in terms of actually sewing, I feel like I tend towards like a lot of 50s patterns. I think they're very cute. Like I love the like very playful, whimsical aspect of this like post-war, like you can start using as much fabric as you want type of like extravagance, which is definitely what this dress is. And I think there's like, yeah, I would say I sew a lot of 50s, a lot of like kind of like 60s office wear, which I find like really glamorous and adorable. They're like very, because like when you think of like 1960s office wear, it's actually like a coat or like a beautiful, you know, jacket, but it's whatever. There we go.
Beautiful.
Yay.
Wow.
But also one thing that's really cool is that designers, this still happens, it doesn't happen as much, but like professional designers would release patterns like based on the clothing that they designed. So like some designers still do it. Rachel Comey has a few really cool patterns. I'm gonna press the seams flat so they lay like really flat and nice. Rachel Comey still does it, but like very influential, amazing designers and costume designers would release patterns. And so like working with those is really awesome. I like just made this Issey Miyake shirt from like a pattern that he released. One of my like first really like projects that I found very challenging was this jacket by like this very unknown, like I want to say he's like a Dutch designer who did a lot of like quilting, like art to wear jackets, and I made one of his. Sorry, I know you can't see this, but I'm just pressing the seams flat. So like that's also really fun because you get to see what these like actual master pattern makers, like how they put their clothes together, which is very special and like really, really cool. Like Dior released a lot of patterns, which I definitely like covet. So yeah, there's such a wide variety that if I'm ever like, oh, okay, this is something I want to start working on, it's very accessible. So let's see. So now I have like the whole bodice front completed. So that's like this whole portion. It's looking a little like sloppy right now. That's fine. There'll be boning, etc. But that's like the general idea. Ta-da. Okay, moving on to like the next step in the instructions is bodice trim. So like what you're supposed to be doing is gathering. So they've used this illustration of like a little like netted piece of fabric, and they want you to gather, like the instructions are asking me to gather it for the bodice trim. I didn't show like myself, I didn't show cutting out like all the pieces of netting yesterday. It's definitely something I'm nervous about, I'm just gonna be honest. Because netting, it's literally just like a net that you're working with. Like it looks like, it's like a net. And this is gonna be the overdress. it goes on everything. I actually tried gathering this one. It like did gather, but like it didn't actually gather. It's like completely sewn together. So we're gonna give this a shot and see what happens. One thing I'm gonna try to do is use like a bit of tissue paper as like stabilizer, because that will like allow me to like sew along the net without actually, so let me see. Like I can easily tear this tissue away from the netting, but it will like allow the netting to stay stable as I'm sewing it. And I'm gonna give that a try. But the basic concept of gathering that we're now gonna attempt to do with netting is that you're using a very long stitch length, so your stitches are really far apart, and then pulling it basically so that the fabric all gathers together.
So what is your normal stitch length when you sew like normal seams?
Yeah, so my normal stitch length is like a 2.5. I don't even know what the unit of measurement is. Do you know what the unit of measurement is for stitch length?
Millimeters, maybe.
Okay, so I'll use like a 2.5 millimeter stitch, which is just like the machine default. And then when I'm gathering or like just basting or doing something that doesn't require like permanent stitching, I'll bump it up to like maybe a 4.5 or even a 5. So let's see. This is going to be a little bit of a journey. Just a word of warning. We will see how this goes. Just getting started.
Pat, I don't know if this is a good time to ask this question, because you might need all your brain power for this.
No, of course.
But I remember we talked about patterns and like sizing. So could you speak a little bit to how you like adapt your personal measurements to whatever patterns you use, or how you find patterns?
Yes, totally. So I will caveat this by saying I'm the worst person in the world to ask, because I am actually a very straight size.
Because you're perfect. We love you.
All patterns are always made for me. I am a straight size, and like I also often will wear, like when I'm making my own clothes, they'll be like slightly baggier. Like I don't always make like the most tight fitting garments. Or they'll have like, if I'm making a top that's like tight to the bust, it'll be like it'll have a lot more ease in the waist or something. So I don't always do like the kind of like very bodycon dresses that would require like very exact pattern measurements. In general, what you want to be doing is looking at the body measurements on the physical printed pattern. They're going to vary from company to company, from era to era, from pattern to pattern, and like between designers. So like what you want to do is look at the exact measurements on the pattern and go off of, if you're making a dress or a top, go off of the bust measurement, which is the fullest part of your bust. If you're making shorts, skirt, pants, you want to go off of the waist measurement. So everyone's body is different. Your like waist measurement and your bust measurement are not going to match the pattern. I mean, mine don't either. Like when I'm making a 32 bust, 25 waist, like that's not my measurements. But like patterns are created with ease built in. That's something we've talked about. The only way to actually know how much ease, which is the extra space, like beyond that like 25-inch waist that's built in, is by actually measuring the pattern pieces. So like once I have this bust, this like bodice piece here, and like the seam allowance has been taken off and it's been all sewn together, like that's how big I know the bust will actually be. So if I was making a very baggy like shirt, like I made recently, that bust might be for a 32-inch bust, but it's designed to be oversized. So whoever the designer was like, this is what I'm going to be putting out for a 35, for a 34 or for a 38 bust, but like it's going to be actually like 40 inches across because I want it to fit very baggy on top. So the only way to actually know like the true size of that pattern piece or of that part of the pattern is by actually measuring the piece itself, the like little crinkly piece of paper itself. But when you only have the pattern envelope in front of you, what you have to do is go off of the measurements on the pattern. And then from there, you have to grade up or down. There's amazing resources for grading online or in books, like however you want to learn. There's videos about it. You can truly make clothing and remake clothing for absolutely any size or any proportion. It takes practice and skill, just like anything with sewing. It's very possible. And depending on what your project is, it's going to be easier or more difficult. If you're making a bodycon dress out of an unforgiving, like say no stretch silk fabric, that's going to be maybe more difficult to like get a perfect grade for than if you're making a shift dress or like a simple camisole. So like the answer is basically it varies, but when you're looking at patterns, you want to be looking at your bust and for tops and dresses and the waist measurement for pants and skirts. That's actually a big reason why I don't really use modern patterns that much, because I find they have a lot of ease. It's almost this like kind of vanity sizing project within patterns, which kind of doesn't make sense because you want to empower people to make clothing that fits them correctly. But like a top or a skirt that's meant for like a 30-inch waist will have 3 inches of ease. That doesn't make sense. You're making like a 33-inch waist skirt. But it does vary from pattern to pattern. And even if you purchase, say, like the wrong size, you can always like kind of, you can fix for that, right? Because you can change that pattern piece once you have it in front of you. So that's kind of like my long form explanation.
That makes sense. It's kind of like online shopping, you know, when I look at clothing, I look at the measurements that matter, right? Like with like wide leg shorts, it's basically the waist, right? Like it doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly. And so my suggestion, like if you're just starting and you're picking your first pattern, like pick a pattern that you're going to feel good about and like good about wearing, even if it does end up like a little big. You know, like I was always making like little jackets and stuff and they turned out too big because I would go off, say, like the waist measurement, but like what you want to be going off of for, say, a jacket is probably the bust measurement. And then they'd end up too big. But the thing is, you can still wear like an oversized jacket. It's just going to look different. Like that's completely fine. It's like no one, you know, like it's fashion. It's very like fluid. You can do whatever you want. So like that's kind of just my take on it, is like it is a learned skill, and like correctly and perfectly tailoring everything is like its own challenge and skill, but it's very doable. And like if that's where your focus is, then like you will be successful. It's very possible. So
I find that also with sewing patterns, even if I'm sewing for someone else, I get really familiar with my own like alterations or with that person's alterations. So even if I find that I get a pattern and it fits me really good in the hip, but really poorly in the waist, like that's just something then that I have learned from sewing this pattern, and just I can take that with me.
Yeah, exactly. That's also why it's like a great idea to, as something my mom mentioned yesterday, is making a muslin, which is making kind of a very quick mock-up of your pattern out of a cheap cotton fabric, because that way you're able to see what parts of the pattern need to be altered in order to get that perfect fit, without like maybe having to take all the measurements of every single pattern piece and like hoping it works out.
Totally.
Getting to the end of this. Going to just, let's see. What I don't want to do is like break this thread, but this does look like it's going to be long. I'm just going to get another piece of tissue paper. I just started saving and hoarding tissue paper for like in advance of this project, knowing that like I'm gonna have to do a lot of net sewing and being like, I wonder how this is gonna go for me. So I guess we're about to find out exactly how it's gonna go for me. Again, like the reason I'm using this net to stabilize, or this tissue paper under the net to stabilize, is because like net is not a fabric. It's just like a little, it's a woven loops of polyester. So sewing it together is like not as easy as just like sewing fabric together. So I'm using the net underneath to stabilize and create a base for it to like sew on. I feel bad because I know that it's literally invisible, like it's impossible to see. But this is going to be the cover for the bodice. Yeah, this is fine. I'm just unraveling the knot. Let's just keep going.
When you do gathering, do you have like how do you know like how much fabric you need before the gathering?
That is part of like why pattern pieces are like why they're made. But it depends on how thick you want the gather to be, right? So if you want like a very thick gather, because you have such a fine fabric, such as net, you got this, because you're using such a fine fabric. If you want a very like puffy, I guess, gather, then you're going to need to use maybe like 4 or 5 times as much fabric as you would if you were going to do like kind of a loose gather of like just for like a regular skirt or something. So it kind of depends, but I mean, again, that's why I will like use pattern pieces because they're designed with like that kind of thing in mind. Let's see. This is like truly a little adventure. I just want to make sure I have enough, because like the tool or the net underneath can rip, it's fine, but like I just don't want to break the seam at all, because it all has to get like pulled in one direction. And like, for example, this pattern actually does take that into effect. So if I was going to make the overdress or this netted part out of fabric rather than netting, so it was just like a sheer layer of fabric over it or something, the pattern pieces, like the pattern piece I would use is smaller. They like have a different suggestion for what piece to use. But that's maybe a little niche. I mean, like making a gigantic like net overdress is maybe like a kind of random, like this is not how the majority of patterns are going to function, I would say. But gathering is a very common technique. Anytime you see those like really cute little like ruffled like bodice tops and stuff like that, like all of that is just like gathered fabric. I think that's also what's like so valuable about learning to sew, is that you can decide like what clothing is, like how you can see how clothing has been made and like determine the value of like that for yourself, because like it feels like the world, like the way fashion is sold and marketed is so divorced from how much things actually cost, like how much the cost of labor actually is. It just truly makes no sense anymore. Like something I mentioned, like we talked about yesterday, is how like a coat in one place will cost like $20. A coat somewhere else, like a new coat, will cost like $2,000. Like how can that be? Of course, there's differences in material and there's differences in design, but at some point it just feels like it's completely like it's arbitrary. So like learning to sew is so powerful in that sense, because it like does give you this greater sense of like what are things worth, and like what are the skills that are truly like difficult and like hard to replicate and like show a level of craftsmanship that maybe is worth investing in. This is totally deranged. It also, like, this is such a bad demonstration, I'm sorry, because it's just me kind of like experimenting and figuring out what's gonna work, rather than me being like, wow, this is exactly how you should do it, because it's probably not, you know?
That's better though. I think it's more inspiring.
Totally.
It's definitely a journey. So I now have like this massive loop of netting attached to like crinkly paper. I can just rip the crinkly paper off. This is gonna be, you know what I'm reminding myself of is like that video of that little girl who's like, and this is how you curl your hair, and she like curls it and then her hair burns off and she's like, stop the video. Not gonna, no hair is getting burned off, but that's kind of the sense that I'm getting.
Do you think that was fake?
I don't know. Her like look of fear is so real.
Oh,
You guys know the video. And it was just so like early 2000s of like, this is how you get like the perfect pin curl in your hair for like the school dance. Oh my God. This is how you do sew netting. Like, just kidding. I'm literally just like ripping the netting off. You know what's funny is like I feel like my mom also knows a lot about this because she does so much embroidery, and you have like stabilizers like this in embroidery as well, to like put underneath the fabric. I should show the audience what kind of mess I'm getting myself into. Let's see. If it doesn't work, like if it's very possible. If this like ends up being a complete like disaster, who knows? Then maybe I'll just move on to the next step and like continue on my journey, and then come back to this and perhaps just like not even worry about gathering, but like kind of manually gather as I sew. Because it is such a sheer fabric. I mean, maybe that's kind of a nutty idea, but for the purposes of demonstration, I feel like it's not the worst thing in the world. Whatever. Making contingency plans.
Have you ever tried gathering by just like doing the stitch with a needle? Like, and
I did. Yeah, I did actually. It doesn't really work because like what you get is like the upper stitch. So all sewing machines have this upper thread and then the bobbin thread, which is in here. And like the upper thread and the lower thread are what gets sewn together to create a stitch. And so like when you're stitching like that through netting, they just like tie around each other and then like create, like, it's not like you're creating, I mean, you're creating a knot in essence, which is fine, but like because they're raveled around each other, you can't pull the thread through in order to create the gather. Maybe what I need to do is like show a gather on a regular piece of fabric so that we can like all be on the same page and in terms of what I'm talking about. But like, oh, here we go. Okay, Shocker is actually working. So like here what I have is like, when I pull on this, it all gathers together along the thread into this little like crunchy little like loop, and then the excess thread is over here. So like because I have the stabilizer underneath, like I'm able to like pull on the thread. Oh, I'm so pleased it worked. But yeah, I mean, the way I come up with like learn things like this is like I will just read about sewing from time to time in my spare time, or like just like, I mean, I'm not a big YouTube person, but like I'll look at YouTube videos if there's something specific I need to learn, but like just like kind of learning different, picking up different concepts from like sewing blogs and stuff like that, like along the way. And then once I need to come back to it, I'm like, oh, I have heard of this somewhere. Like, let me look this up because I think it's this. So like any kind of sewing project that you come across that's like confusing, like anything you learn will truly be so valuable in the future. That's what I also love about sewing is like, I've talked about this, I feel like a million times now, but like this ability that like, okay, like this project was a complete wash, but like I feel like the next project I do is going to be so much easier because of it, and it always is. So like I truly love that. That's so special. I guess that's how you learn everything, but like sewing brings me particular joy. So. I also remember like my first like sewing clothing project in college was like I sewed like literally 2 pieces of mesh together in like a pillowcase kind of format and then wore it as a dress over this other black dress I had. And I was like, I made this, isn't it amazing? And everyone was like, wow, great job. And it was like the most bizarre thing I've ever worn. It was like not cute at all. It was so weird. But now here I am making a wedding dress, so just goes to show. And that was what? That was like 3 years ago or something. So I've come so far. I'm just gathering it now. I'm just gathering. Right now what I'm thinking about is like, should I even do the other side? Should I even gather the other side? Or should I kind of just like let it manually get gathered as I sew the top of this onto the top of the bodice? And I'm kind of leaning towards the second, which is maybe like a little bit cheap, but that's okay. But that is okay. So, one thing that I wanted to ask today's participants, because it is Labor Day, because like clearly been thinking a lot about like value and labor lately, is like when you are choosing clothes or when you engage with like buying new clothes, which we all do, like I love buying new clothes, or buying used clothes as it were, like I'm such an eBay fiend, is like what do you look for? And like when you do see such vastly disparate prices for things that like seem to be the same thing, like what are you thinking about? That's what I want to know. Like when you see something, when you know that like, okay, I could get this same coat somewhere else for way cheaper, like what are you thinking? Just go.
I think like kind of what you were talking about earlier, about how once you learn how to make clothing, you kind of look for quality when you're shopping. So sometimes if I see something where I'm like, wow, I would never be able to sew that, that's really hard, like then I'd be like, okay, that's worth buying. But yeah, I just feel like there's so many factors that go into it too. Like I think about what I have in my closet, what would I wear it with, what occasion would I wear it for? Because I have a problem where like I'll go into the thrift store and pick like the craziest thing I can find. I'm like, I love this, but then I'm like, wait, how often are you really gonna wear this? And like, what can you wear it with? And then now my closet is just full of like weird clothing. And so yeah, some of that stuff I think about. Yeah. But yeah, I feel like that as I'm getting older and like learning more and stuff, I'm looking more for like spending more money on less items of clothing. But yeah, but it can be hard when you're like, oh, I want this like trendy thing and I can get it like really cheap at H&M or whatever. But yeah, I try not to do that so much. More like shopping at thrift stores, or like for me, it's hard because I'm tall, so I'll try to buy like basics from store, like more big box stores like Gap or like J. Crew, because they have a tall section. So, but now I'm feeling more inspired to try and like make more of my own clothes so they'll fit better. Yeah, but it's also been weird because I work at a screen printing studio, so I feel like I never wear real clothes anymore. I'm always in like floppy clothes or like at home in my pajamas. So I haven't really bought a lot of clothing in the past couple of years, which has been kind of good. But I'm like, what will I do if I have a different job and get all tempted again to buy a bunch of clothes?
Yeah, that's real. Like I really appreciate what you said about like, oh, now that I know how clothes are made, like I can tell maybe more what kind of thing is difficult to recreate, or like I'm just not going to recreate. Here we go, it's like all crinkled up. like what kind of thing is like quote unquote worth it? Like it does make me sad to be so like, I mean, I just moved and so now I'm like buying furniture for the first time, and the big thing is like, oh my God, why are rugs so expensive? But like, I don't know, because they're like hand woven and like take a lot of time, and I don't like very skilled labor. But I think like with clothing as well, people really don't see that, because it's like, how can it be skilled labor if a t-shirt costs $5? So yeah, I think that's a very real question, and that's something that sewing like really gives you the power to like discern in a very like unique and special way that I just really appreciate. Here it is, little bodice. This is like a little like lingerie moment, but it's gonna sewn on to a real piece of fabric. So this is kind of what we have going on. I've kind of just gathered it to a random length because it's very easy to like ungather. Like I can just slide it off the thread because I have this very long continuous piece of thread, which is what I just sewed. And then I can like manipulate this along the thread because I did not back tack. I left like a lot of thread and I had a very long stitch length. So that's how gathering works. Because you're not going backwards over the piece of thread itself, like that means that the fabric, especially like a loose net like this, can move very freely over this very thin piece of thread. That's what gathering is. And like that's what has to be attached to this piece ultimately. So let's read the instructions and see what it has to say. I have gathered it. I've gathered it. Pin wrong side of trim on the right side of the bodice, matching centers front, small dots at centers back, and placing remaining small dots at side seams as shown. Adjust gathers to distribute evenly and baste row edges together. It's a lot of words. So like I would initially, when I like would read sewing instructions like that, I would be like, what are they saying? Like, what on earth is this? In reality, like you just have to maybe read it once or twice, familiarize yourself with the picture and what you think it's saying. So many times I would read a sewing instruction and be like, I don't even know where to start. Like, this is crazy. I have to just skip this step or just take a random guess. Like, what on earth is this? But in reality, like you are just going to follow the instructions, just reread them carefully and like all will become clear. Look at the picture, take a breath, step away. It will be fine. What they're saying is you want like the inside edge, the wrong side. It's net, it doesn't have a wrong side. You want like the wrong supposed side of the fabric. If this was like 2-color fabric, or if the inside was dull and the outside was shiny, that's what like wrong side would mean. You want like the dull side against the right quote unquote side, the outside of your sewing piece. They're like match dots, etc. Matching dots is not going to be possible with net. So what I have to do is just like pin it along here, like in this fashion, so that it like matches up to, you know, the ends will match. That's all that's going to happen. It's like the ends of each of these nettings is going to match to the like end pieces, the very outside edges of this bodice. Like that's all that's going to happen. And like, I kind of feel like I'm a very sort of like, whatever with my sewing. And I like don't necessarily want to give the impression that it's just like, oh, just take a guess, it might work out. Like I've made so many mistakes, like as for one my mom can attest to. Like there's a lot that can go wrong, but my philosophy is always like, okay, it's not the end of the world, like it's gonna turn out good, so don't worry too much. And like I know what it will look like in the end. Like I know what they want from me, so like from there I can kind of just like, you know, follow the instructions and be successful. Sewing is about optimism. Let's see. So all I've done is, I should just turn this down here. Just see my legs. All I've done is just connect each edge of the netting edge to like each far edge of the bodice. Like that's all I'm doing to start. And then from there, I'm going to adjust the gathers so that they're like evenly distributed along the netting, because like I want this to be the correct length and I want it to be like evenly distributed so that there's not like one chunk that's like completely ruffled and then one chunk that's like completely flat. Like if that makes sense. So let's see, just like gathering and ungathering, just so it'll lay flat. Like there's so much extra fabric here. And it's funny because like all these little like pink little fluffs, several of them are still on here. What's something about like fashion and clothes that like brings you joy and happiness? I think like there's a lot of things that's wrong with fashion right now that are very frustrating. There's like a lot bad, but like for some reason we're all still here and we actually all do have to wear clothes for better or for worse. So what's something that brings you joy?
I love when I'm out in public in the city and I see people react to what I'm wearing, and like no matter what the reaction is, I love that, because I feel like otherwise people don't really feel the need to interact with strangers. So I know that like whatever people are feeling is, for better or for worse, intense.
I don't know who just spoke, but I 1000% agree.
It's me, it's Sophia.
Sophia, yay, wow.
I've been here.
You've been here. Well, you've been quiet. You've been just sitting and absorbing. Hi, Sophia. Sophia's like my best friend. We went to Duke together, and we both love causing a stir of angry reactions as we march around in whatever outfit of the day.
We love the good ones too.
The more they freak out, the better. There's nothing more joyful than that, just like getting a rise out of people. Does anyone else have input?
Very similar for me. I have also had people stop me actually and say like something like on a rainy day, oh, you're just like a piece of sunshine. You brought a smile to my face. Yeah, that's the absolute best, because I'm just like, I was trying to do something for me and it had this effect on you, and that's like so cool. I wasn't planning it, but it's pretty cool.
That's amazing. I love that. It's such a like beautiful and friendly way. I love when strangers talk to me. Like that's what I love about being in New York. It's so sad that this is like not something that really happens anymore. And like it's not something that most people, like a lot of people don't really like it. I love being engaged with, and with fashion, it's like so much in my control how like, because I've made such a deliberate choice. So like someone talking to me on the train is actually very welcome, because I'm like, wow, like I know I'm presenting a certain way. I'm like, I know you're going to talk to me. So
yeah. Well, you're communicating non-verbally with people, and they're essentially just like continuing that conversation or picking up what you're putting down.
Yeah, exactly. I love that. It's such a like beautiful moment of connection, because whether they're like totally weirded out and making like a somewhat rude comment, which I always find hilarious, or like whether they're complimenting me, like it's always like a funny and beautiful moment. I was wearing like a bird coat one time. I have like this coat with birds on it, and then I was also wearing a necklace that like happened to also have birds on it.
Aww.
And this older woman on the train just looked at me and she was like, "You really like birds, huh?"
Aww.
She was like so deadpan about it, and I was like, "You know what? I really like birds." So like, I don't know what you're trying to say to me, but whatever it is, I'm laughing.
Yeah.
So,
It sounds like she was making a joke. That's pretty, like, it's like, oh, you're observant.
exactly. Like, you know what? She's right too.
Guess what? Not wrong.
I love birds.
That's really sweet. Do you like birds as a
I like birds. I think they're cool. I love like a wild bird, a toucan.
Mhm.
My sister
I want
just
to
saw
see your bird outfit.
a bird outfit.
Your bird outfit. It sounds cool.
Yeah, isn't that so funny? It's like this red coat with like photorealistic birds printed on it that my boyfriend's mom gave me, and then I have this mother of pearl like bird necklace, and like it's just like this huge red coat. I've only worn it a couple of times because I like love coats. I have a variety of them, but just like her deadpan delivery of like you love birds, I was like, you got me. So yeah. Anyone else have reasons why they love fashion? Love clothes?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think some of the same reasons, like it's a conversation starter. Yeah, I feel like it is a way to like friendly, like open up a conversation with strangers without it being like creepy or weird. You know what I mean? You could just be like, hey, I really like your style or your coat or whatever.
Yeah.
And then you might find you have other things in common, and yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, such an amazing way to make friends, like just like meet new people. I love that. It is communication. Like I think because it's so in the current moment, I guess, or for the past whatever 60 years, it's so driven by consumerism that like we get defined by like the brands that's associated or like a brand messaging when like in reality like it's your own language that you're allowed to make up and like speak that
Yeah.
like shouldn't be related to a brand.
Yeah, I really like the kind of advent of street style and like all the blogs that were documenting that, and I feel like that kind of gave back the power to the consumer of like mixing and matching, you know, high and low, or you know, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I remember watching the Bill Cunningham documentary, and how he was saying how like back in the day people would like make fun of women for like not wearing things exactly as they came off the runway.
Mm-hmm.
And he was super against that, and just how his work really showed like how people were putting together clothing creatively in different ways, and that it like wasn't just dictated by the designer or the brand, but like the person's personal choice.
Yeah, that's amazing. So yeah, I mean that's one of the things that like really when I think about like, oh, clothing being accessible, like it's true that like now clothing is cheaper than ever, and like that has negative ramifications in a lot of ways because it is bad, you know, like it's like I think we can just unequivocally say that like having textiles be so cheaply produced is bad in terms of like the global impact, but at the same time like the democratization of fashion has so much like positive power because it allows people to communicate like regardless of like I mean regardless of social class, like I mean it's true regardless of like your income, because like fashion should be available for everyone. We should all be able to communicate in this way.
I have a thought.
Yeah, please.
I just moved to Hudson, New York, and this is a town which is really gentrified, like extremely gentrified, and there's like a very stark class like divide just within a couple of streets.
Mm-hmm.
The main street here is full of antique shops and like vintage clothing stores, and they're all extremely expensive.
Yeah.
One street over, it's like a very different situation, and I've been thinking a lot as I walk up and down the streets like looking in the windows, I feel like on one level really attracted to these vintage clothes, and on the other level like really like nauseated and disgusted with like how expensive they are, and like this sort of ego-driven like need to like be special like through expensive clothing or something.
Mhm.
And it's just been making me think about like what it might mean to purposefully blend in more. I don't know, it's made me feel like averse in a way to like styling myself in a very like stylish way.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you for sharing that. That's really, really valid. And like, as vintage becomes so trendy and so popular, like that's another message, especially when like so much like really of fashion and pop culture comes from like, say, Black America. And like when you talk about like, oh, like the classic example of like, oh, really long acrylic nails and stuff like that, like these are things that have been around, but like now that it's very fashionable to like, you know, wear certain things, like what are you actually saying? Like there's so much nuance that does end up getting lost.
Yeah, I guess it has me like interrogating like the need to stand out or like differentiate myself from others, you know. And yeah, I don't know, like I really am interested in expressing myself or whatever and creating new work, but I also like am asking myself what that means, and can I express myself by being completely nondescript on some level. I don't know. Yeah, it's just stuff I'm thinking about.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And like thinking about individualism and like individualism during the pandemic, where when it kind of turns into this like, oh, you can't tell me what to do, like at the risk of people's like other people's health, stuff like that.
Totally.
Very
I
interesting.
sometimes fantasize about having to wear uniforms because I think of that exactly. But this is coming from someone who really loves to like get dressed up and stand out. But I totally like, I feel that as well. Like it's a duality for me, because I did go to school with uniforms, and I do kind of, I mean, as corny as it is to me, you know, those like successful tech entrepreneurs who just wear the same thing every day because they have less decision making.
So do a lot of designers, actually. Like look
right.
at Michael.
Yeah. I was thinking about that too. It kind of reminded me of like when, you know, when Project Runway first came out, and like Michael Kors was one of the judges, and he was always wearing the same like black turtleneck or something. And like that was when, I don't know, maybe I was like starting to study fashion, so I didn't understand. I was like, that's so boring, you know. But when he explained it, I was like, now I get it. Because also I feel like we're so preoccupied with making or like, you know, creating, that like then to have to think about what to wear each day can sometimes be just like another decision to make, or like another thing that gets
when your time could be better spent elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, I feel the same way. Like sometimes, yeah, I do want to get dressed up and like put some effort into how I look, but then other times I'm like, oh, I just want to, have some kind of uniform or something.
I take it in this way now, where because I am involved with making clothes, I understand that it takes so long to try a new anything. So I've also slipped into this place since I've started doing it more seriously, of wearing something like a uniform. So I have a few, maybe like 15 outfits that are just like always ready to go, and like, you know, pretty versatile. Or there's an even spread of like going very casual to like sort of dressy, but it's just easily mindless. And if I'm changing my wardrobe by like buying something new, it's often like a basic piece. But then if I want to make something that is kind of out there and feels new, then that gives me that opportunity that I used to, like some of you are saying, get so much enjoyment from just like putting on the razzle dazzle. Like I'll wear something that in my mind is a piece that is in progress. And so that's where the razzle dazzle comes from, is just, this is unfinished and no one has ever seen it before. And it might be like kind of weird to look at and uncomfortable, but this is my way of like getting to know, like, oh, the ins and outs of construction. Is like, well, I made this for myself and it doesn't exactly work, but this is what works about it. Like treating dressing more as experimentation.
I like that idea. That's cool.
It's fun.
Yeah.
Everyone try it.
Yeah, this is like something I discovered when I like started paying more attention to how I dressed, is I actually became more minimalistic in a way, in the sense that like, you know, I spend more on shoes now, right? But like I have less pairs of shoes, and I have shoes that are my favorites, that are comfortable, that are like well made and have stood the test of time. And that could be my uniform, you know? So in a way, like, even though I am kind of commanding attention, I still, in my own way, like I have my own uniform, and everything kind of harmonizes more in my closet, almost because I am more experimental. You know, as someone was just saying, when clothing and getting dressed becomes, you know, kind of a end in itself, I think that's very different. Whereas like if somebody doesn't really care about, you know, how they look or how they present, you know, maybe they could rely on like less clothing, less experimentation. But for me, I just find that I really love the process.
Yeah, I feel like since moving to New York, my whole shoe strategy has totally changed. I'm like, because New York just eats your shoes. Like,
So many times I've cried about that. I'm like, this is really happening. Like, this shoe is ruined. No. Yeah.
You guys have mentioned like having a sort of uniform. Do you guys feel like, do you guys do that for work? Because I know my work is mostly, at least when we used to go back into the office, it was largely male. And I noticed that like if I put like even just like makeup on, or like one time I wore a sweater that was like, it was not revealing at all, but people started like making really uncomfortable comments and like sexualizing me, or like they would do that for one of the other girls who would like dress up and wear heels or something. And it's just so weird when you're like, okay, this is like an act of expression, but you know, I don't know, I'm just wearing like a sweater and a skirt. It's nothing, I don't know. It just seemed odd to me that people took like that, I don't know, even like trying as
an invitation.
right.
God. Well, first of all, I'm so sorry.
Sound like assholes. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, that's so gross. That's like your workplace.
Yeah, it was odd for sure. Like I remember when the other girls would like put a lot of effort into like her hair and like wear like cute outfits and shoes and stuff. And I remember when the guy was like, "Oh, do you think she's trying to snag a rich like, you know, manager or something?" Like what?
Oh my God.
Just because she's not wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants doesn't mean like.
That's so gross.
I know. It was truly
Is it
awful.
too late to like get them fired?
Oh.
Ooh, I actually did have like a whole thing with HR where I made some complaints. The HR lady got really overwhelmed and quit. So
What?
yeah, I don't think she like calculated everything that was happening, but it's fine because now we don't go into the office.
So
I hope you don't have to deal with that still, though.
I'm going to just like turn off my camera now for work stuff.
oh my God.
Oh, yeah. Please feel free. I think the thing that sucks about that, too, the most for me is just I feel like I've always at least had discussions with myself that I dress for myself. And like even to the point at the beginning of quarantining, a friend of mine who makes clothes was talking about like losing the desire to really dress up. And I just hadn't gotten to that point until recently. So I was still just like, oh no, like blinders on, like I wear my fanciest outfits for breakfast at home and going to the grocery store. And at the same time, I do realize or like deal with dating and like even just like men in general thinking that it's like for them, or like there's like a culture of like heterosexuality that just says like, oh, like if you're trying, this is for a man. If you're wearing heels, this is for a man. And it's like not often spoken about, but like constant running dialogue. But I feel
like I don't know if they think the world is like centered on them or something.
Yeah, that's such a great way of putting that.
Yes, we
The
do.
world is centered around them. Yeah. Confirmation. Yeah. We got one finally. Yeah. Thank you for
That's
being
so
on.
funny because I feel like I'm so ridiculous and audacious, like just wearing heels to the grocery store, that at this point my boyfriend is just like, if he had it his way, I would just wear sneakers just so we would get places faster.
Yeah. Well, that's for like, you know, imagine if the situation was reversed. If you were wearing sneakers and he was like, you should really wear heels to the grocery store. Like that's such a different situation than you choosing to do that and saying like, this is what I want, like agency.
Right. Well, he just protested in the background. He was like, that's not true. He was like, I love when you wear heels.
Man, I'm just kidding.
Well, he has no choice anyway, so I'm glad he likes it.
Also, I have to bring this up because I love historical fashion, and there's a YouTube video in my like waiting to watch list that's about how I think like it was a man that started the trend that women shouldn't be wearing corsets and that kind of coupled with like the women's suffragette movement that started the trend of like 1920s looser fitting gowns and stuff like that. And I'm a big fan of corsets. I think they're awesome and really comfortable. And I don't know, I just think that just popped up in my head because I'm thinking about like what role men have played in the history of women's clothing generally. It almost feels like sorry.
Oh, sorry, I interrupted.
No.
Did corsets like actually squeeze people's organs and stuff, or is that literally just like a myth?
Wait, what did you say?
So I guess I don't remember where, but I had heard that like corsets, you know, like damage women's organs or something. I mean, obviously, I guess it would depend on how tight you tied it, but is it like actually destructive, or was that just like a narrative?
Those people, to my knowledge, would be wearing them extremely tight. Because it should fit you. That's what the proper way to wear a corset is one that is fitting your body, and then not to do it to lace it up too tight. But there's definitely people to this day who wear them every single day and don't have squeezed organs, or I think it can affect your anatomy very, very marginally over a very, very long time of using it consistently. But that's not, it's not like a torture device. What it does is it holds your waist in, but it also can correct your posture. And this is like the first iteration of a bra comes from a corset, basically, because they would wear a blouse or like it looks like a nightgown today, but like a underdress and then a corset underneath it. So that's kind of like similar similar garment. I'm not a big bra fan also, so I don't know.
I have a question. Where can I get a good corset? Like, can you pop that in the chat? Like, where to shop?
Yeah, there's actually a really great resource for making corsets. I know that's not what you said, but if you want a super long project, there's a few people who do custom corsetry. I don't even know where you would get like a good ready to wear corset these days, but some people are coming to my mind right now, and I'm sure that there's somewhere where you could find one that's really good for you.
If you check
what's this
out
place
the
called?
Lingerie Addict, she definitely will have like really good resources.
Where is that? Is that a website or is that like an Instagram?
It's a blog, like, so it's a website. It's this woman, I think her name's Cora Harrington, and she like has a blog on like any kind of like underpinnings or like any sort of like any kind of underwear, bras, corsets, you know, lingerie, anything. It's called the Lingerie Addict, TLA, and she's awesome. So she'll definitely, like, I'm sure she has like blogs on that in terms of like actual resources.
I'm gonna put it in the chat.
I'm gathering again. I'm like gathering the midriff front. So it's just another like net gathering exercise. Another side. I'm taking off the tissue paper so that I can have like the net.
Have you ever made a dress or an outfit out of like a pre-existing one that you found? Like, I don't know, have you taken the fabric off of like a dress or something that you found and made it into something else? Or have they mostly been from new sheets of fabric?
I have to think about that. I was never like a big, like I think it's like a really amazing way that I keep seeing people getting into sewing by like having like an oversized t-shirt and turning it into like a shirt and a skirt or something. I honestly can't, I mean, I've probably done something like that and just like use the fabric, but I don't know. Like usually I will start from scratch. I love when people modify existing clothes. It's such a like fun and easy way, especially stuff that's like so challenging, like collars or like little like front plackets with buttons on them, like stuff like that. That's so hard. You can like get that for free by like cutting up a shirt and then turning it into a dress. So I think it's a really awesome way to get into sewing and like one I like wholeheartedly recommend. I just don't know if I've ever done it. Yeah, I think I do a lot of like stuff from scratch. Does anyone here have like memories about sewing that they like talking about, or like seeing a mom or like a grandparent or your dad like sewing or mending, like making Halloween costumes, stuff like that?
I have a story.
Yes, please.
I've talked a lot, but I'll tell this anyway. So my mom made me, for Halloween, the Sleeping Beauty dress. Like, you know, at the end where, if you've seen Sleeping Beauty, it switches from pink to blue
Uh-huh.
at the end. And she made me the pink one. And I wore it like so much. I like Halloween ended and I wore it like all the time. Like the only time I wasn't wearing it was when I was in school. And I wore it so much that I grew out of it and we had to cut the sleeves off.
Oh my
because,
God.
my legs and arms grew, but my torso didn't grow. And then eventually, like I couldn't fit into it anymore, but we kept it forever. And then we kept it in the attic, and I just never wanted to get rid of it. And then some mice nested in it and had babies on it. And she threw it away without telling me, and I was really devastated.
Oh my God. Well, a new mom got her home.
Right?
I feel
And
like
then
a very Disney ending.
What's up?
I feel like that's a very Disney ending, though. Like a little family of animals.
New baby got to wear the dress.
So true. I still have the Little Mermaid costume she made me though, and it's like gorgeous. It's all sparkly, and I'm gonna save it for like whatever young person I wind up being around later.
That's amazing. That is so cute. What a beautiful little story. I remember one time I was like helping out with a school play in maybe like 8th or 9th grade. And they were like, oh, we need to figure out how to get these like costumes. And I was like, my mom can make them, and just like volunteered her without asking. And they were like, wow, amazing. Thanks so much. And then she had to like stay up making these costumes for like a play that her child wasn't even in. I was just like helping out. And I just remember she was like, I can't believe you've made me do this. And she did a beautiful job, but it's so funny because now that I like sew, I would be so mad.
Well, maybe she'll get you back and volunteer you for a school play to make something happen.
Waiting for the day. She's like, get ready. Let me explain what I'm doing real quick. So the next step, so hold on, let me actually show. So I sewed the top to the bottom. Do we have a time check? Oh, we only have like half an hour. Wow. So I sewed the top to the bottom and the bottom of the little like of the tulle, and now like the whole upper mesh piece looks like this. Which like as you remember, it's this. So now it's like has this like little froofy overdress, like the netting. The next step is to do the same thing with like the midriff piece, which is like the piece that goes directly underneath that net piece. Like will also have like a similar little like net piece happening over it that I just gathered. So that will come next. In the interest of time, I'm like trying to see if maybe I should do something else, because the next parts are just going to be doing like midriff trim. Maybe I should just keep going instead of like skipping around. But basically, yeah, what's just now happening is like continuing on by trimming all of these very simple front pieces that I've cut out. Like before they even go together, each piece is getting the trim added on. And so like why that happens before the dress comes together rather than like making two dresses and have the outer one like sewn on is now like once this piece gets sewn to the piece below it, the seam lines where the stitching is will be invisible, like because it'll be like sewn into like part of the dress, which is like something else about like when you're sewing that maybe when you're coming up with a pattern from scratch that you don't necessarily think about. Like I know when I first started and like I wasn't always using patterns, I would just sew based on what I wanted, what I thought that the final product would look like. But like there's ways to reinforce or create like this, like a piece of clothing so that you don't see like every seam line or every like embellishment and like once that's done. So I think, I mean, kind of a digression, I guess, but it's just something to like think about if you are drafting your own patterns or you're looking to say like copy an existing piece of clothing, which is something I like wholeheartedly recommend, is just like looking out for things that maybe are not immediately apparent on the final piece of clothing that still are required for that that sewing to like kind of come together. I love like copying. Like something I've been kind of challenging myself to do is like when I find pieces of clothing that I like online, or when I see it like in a picture, is like thinking about like how or if I could recreate that, because like I think it's a valuable exercise, but it's also like a fun way to like kind of spend an afternoon, because like maybe I don't want to spend like an exorbitant amount of money on this like little designer top, but if I can make my own, like then I've learned something, and I've also like, you know, gained a new article, like gained the article of clothing. But like I think that does require like, oh, I know that when I see this line in the bodice, like that's a dart. So when I'm like making my pattern, I have to like include darts in it. So that's like why I think it's sometimes useful to like start out like working from patterns, so that when you see certain stitch lines on existing pieces of clothing, you know how that piece of clothing is put together, which I think is super valuable. So just something to consider, like if you want to start making your own clothes. Yeah, just things to think about. Of course, like I just think anyone can jump in and try different things. Like no matter what, you're gonna learn something valuable. But I don't know, just things to think about. Now I'm sewing the netting onto the midriff front piece. Backpack. Netting is half on. Now I'm doing the other side. One thing that's kind of funny is that actually the pattern piece for the netting that I'm sewing on right now was actually missing from the pattern, because I bought this pattern secondhand, and like I bought it from that Facebook group that I talked about yesterday, which is Vintage Sewing Pattern Auction Parlor. And normally like people who sell patterns on that through the Facebook group are like very professional, and like I've never ever had a problem, and like I wouldn't really count this as a problem either, but like they're very, like people are very diligent, because in a lot of cases like their whole job is pattern reselling. But like this one actually had a piece missing, and I was like, oh my god, I'm about to go into day 2 of this sewing workshop and like not have like a certain pattern piece, how I'm going to work around this. But pattern envelopes have, or like at least vintage ones, they don't do it as much anymore, but it still happens, have pictures of the pattern pieces on them, so you kind of know what to expect. And then I looked at the other netting pieces that were supposed to cover like different parts of the bodice, and I was able to kind of like puzzle out that it would just be like this exact under piece but twice as long to create the netting. And I like figured that out based on like the way that the netting piece for the bodice back was created. So like there's ways to draft your own pattern pieces based on existing patterns. But yeah, that was just kind of a fun little disaster right before we started the day.
So I see what you're doing with the pulling and the, what do you call it, ruffling, thingamajiggy, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But
the coloring, yeah.
I'm really curious how you're going to hide that. Like, what's the end thing look like?
Yeah.
And is there a part of the, is there a loose part of the netting that's going to show separate, or will it be sewed on both sides and 4 sides, or?
Yeah, so I think this like bodice top piece is actually like the best example. The netting is like the fluffiest, and you can clearly see it on both the top and the bottom. So in terms of the bottom of the netting, like you can see it looks like a huge mess right now, right? Like if I were to just wear this, like you would just be able to see the whole raw edge. But this piece is going to connect to this bodice upper piece and be like pinned together. Let me just like quick and dirty pin them together and sewn along the seam line that is like currently has the edges of the ruffles on it. So once you pin it together and sew along, like that's this, hold on, let me add another pin. It will no longer be visible because It'll be basically seamed over and it'll be on the inside.
And the silk is sandwiching the two pieces of netting?
Yes. So like the silk is kind of like, I should add even more pins, but the silk is like just hiding all of this netting because like I'm sewing on with the right sides, with the outsides together, so that then when the outsides are revealed, like you can no longer see the seam line. So here, maybe it's a little more clear now, but like once they're sewn together, like you can no longer see that seam. I mean, of course it'll be like a bit more neat, but you can no longer see that like
right. But the top is going to be open ruffle at the top, or you're going to, how?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's several different ways that patterns kind of like deal with this problem, because like most of the time you just don't want that seam line to be visible. The most common way that you deal with this is with a piece called facing. Facing is the piece, an identical piece like this that will face like on the opposite side. So on the inside, instead of having like these little like scrappy little pieces, you're actually, and like this is like my magic demonstration moment, you will sew an identical piece onto that first bodice piece, and then that will hide the seam line in the exact same way. So what you do is you have, let me actually lay it out, maybe on the floor, maybe on the iron. Let's see here. Can we see this? Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe I should face it the other way so we get better light. Cool. Okay. So here's my original piece. This is the piece that's going to be my bodice upper, like this is on the outside. Then I have my facing piece, which is the exact same internal piece as the bodice upper, but it has no decoration on it. This is what's going to be lying flat against your skin.
Okay.
Or against like whatever undergarments you're wearing. So what I do is I'm going to face both of these to each other. So it's kind of like a little sandwich with the lace on the inside. I'm going to sew all the way around and like leave the bottom unsewn. So let's just, for the sake of example, like use pins as like kind of like my basting stitches. I'm like sewing all the way around. And then what will happen as like this big reveal moment is these will get folded out against each other. The facing will be on the inside, and then the outside of and the top edge of the bodice is going to be like nicely faced against this.
Okay, so it's not an open edge at the top. It's
no.
That would be sealed too.
Yeah, it's sealed. So you could also, like, as a design element, like leave it open, and you could have the line of ruffle like kind of left open. It's a design choice. The reason why this one actually has it closed off and fully faced is because there's going to be like corsetry boning. We were just talking about corsets, but there's going to be plastic boning. Let me grab it. That looks like this, which is like kind of this like firm plastic along that facing. So that has to be covered like by the facing on the inside, and also by like the actual bodice on the outside as it like holds up the dress.
Right.
So if it didn't have that kind of boning on the inside, it would be possible to just leave it open and like have that design element be that you have like a little bit of ruffle up at the top. And like other patterns will do that, or like other patterns will have a partial facing, so it's not an entirely separate element, but it's just like the first couple inches so that it kind of like folds over and like lays flat like that. But there's different ways of kind of like hiding the seam lines, because like it looks messy, but that's like because it will be hidden.
My question about an open top, what do you call it, netting versus folded in and hidden edge, is when you cut the netting, I cut netting, which I have done in the past, when I cut for rough stuff, right? When I cut netting, the edge never looks attractive, right? In fact, I usually would fold it if I'm doing something with it just to hide the rough edge.
Yes.
How do you get a clean cut along the squares to make it look pretty, to make it not look unattractive? You know?
If you have that, I would honestly do it after it's already sewn, and then go along with small clippers and like individually kind of like clean it up along the existing edge. Like I would leave a good deal of kind of allowance on top,
Right.
and cut down from there, rather than like hoping when you both cut and then sew that it'll end up in the correct placement. I would just leave like a couple inches on top and then like neaten it up once it's sewn.
Right. Okay.
That is what's nice about netting, is because it's just like a woven little net. It will never fray. It doesn't have to be like finished like silk or
that was one of my questions. Does it fray? It never frays. It's the way it's. What is the netting made out of?
This one's like a stretch polyester. Like it's literally plastic. I found it on the side of the road. So
Okay.
it's hard to say exactly, but yeah, it's like a plastic.
Okay.
I mean, when you're talking about like a lace netting, it can be made out of cotton or like silk threads. But I would say like probably most contemporary netting is gonna be like, it's gonna be plastic. It's like that kind of net or tulle you feel on like children's ballet skirts or whatever else netting is used for. So yeah, I'm time check. Okay, we have like 10 minutes, which is not a super long time. I've finished like this bodice piece, which is going to end up being attached to the upper like bust area that we were just looking at. And then maybe tomorrow I will actually save like boning for tomorrow, because I think that's going to be, bye Jamie, thank you for coming. I think boning is going to be kind of cool to learn about, because we've been talking about corsets so much. So today I'll probably finish up like sewing the skirt together, because that's usually just straight stitches, and then like finishing up parts of the bodice netting. I'll leave the floor open if anyone wants to like chat about things.
That skirt has like these really interesting gathers on the netting piece too, right? I think from the picture.
Yes.
How are you excited about that? Are you nervous?
I'm like a tiny bit terrified. Let me see if I can grab the pattern envelope. It's here, it's here. So what Do is talking about is like these net gathers along the edge, and also these like 4 little rosettes. There's like another one in the back that's visible there. I have no idea how that's going to go. I will say a big kind of like aspect of why this dress looks the way it does is there's petticoats underneath. So like you can't see it and it's like not part of the pattern, but like the illustration, she is would wear like layers of stiff crinoline petticoat underneath, which like I think also people see as very old fashioned, but that's just the only way to get a skirt to kind of flare like it does. You can use a stiffer fabric like a taffeta, or like any sort of very stiff woven. Yeah, I guess taffeta is a really good example. And that will get a level of volume. Silk just will not get that volume. It's just going to fall kind of straight. But otherwise, like the way to get that kind of volume that you see on the illustration is with petticoats. But in terms of the actual like little sash that goes along the bottom, no idea how it's going to go. I'm excited to see. I've never done anything like that before. So yeah, I'll save that for tomorrow as well.
Woohoo! It's exciting that you're doing something new, and we're just gonna be here with you and root you on, and it's gonna go great. Yeah.
Thank you. It's been an adventure since the first minute, so I'm excited. Thank you guys so much for this amazing discussion today. I really, really appreciated hearing what everyone had to say about how you approach dressing and fashion. I like love to hear that. So many insightful comments, so thank you for educating me as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. This was cool.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck with the rest of your project.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you. Enjoy your Labor Day. See you guys tomorrow for last little touch up. Have a good one.
Back
Take care.
tomorrow at 11.
Bye. Bye. Bye, Mommy. Sam, thank you so much for coming.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you so much, Stu.
Okay. Thank you. You're doing awesome. Today was great. I'm looking forward to tomorrow.
It was very fun to hear from everyone, and like hopefully I will get enough done today that tomorrow will go smoothly, but it's been really fun. I'm glad that we're getting a good turnout. I'm gonna stop recording.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And oh yeah, true. Stop.